All right. First time I've seen that also. That was pretty good, wasn't it? Because it certainly helps describe, what we go through, a lot of the things that we go through, especially when, the neighbor does better than we do or we see something that we like. And it's a great introduction for us to start this new series, which if you kind of looked at the title, maybe you saw it last week, last Sunday during Easter, you thought, okay, what are we getting into? And yes, we're getting into marriage, relationships, all those things that are really, really sticky. Just to let you know, I'm already prepared because every time we do this, and we do this usually once a year, I get more comments, more people unhappy, with the fact that I even brought it up or even talked about it. People who've decided, that it's a pointing to only a one way of life and nothing else, fits, and especially in today's culture, maybe one of the most controversial issues that there is for us to talk about or for us to deal with when we deal with marriage and relationships and all those things. And just to let you know, the title of it, the grass is always greener. I know most people think, I've heard that before. I know what you're talking about, whatever. But it wasn't my idea. It was one of my neighbors. One of my neighbors came up with using that phrase, and not because they were picking sermon titles, but they were just talking about it. And one of my neighbors, it's one of the ones we'll get to later on, said, going through life and experiencing all the things of life that I have, here's the reality. The grass is always greener where you water it. Right? Well, yeah. It's your yard's that way, your life's that way, where you take care of it and where you put the effort in, it changes everything. But we're going to come up with a lot of different titles and a lot of different angles on something like this. And if you saw the first one, we're jumping right into it. Just head on, because we came up with the title. Is it going to pop up on the screen, or it was already up there? Oh, yeah. The grass is always greener through the eyes of the, say this with me, of the. Yeah. In other words, there is an envy that we have, right? We look at what someone else has, or we look at, someone else's life, or we see the circumstances of their life. And you've done this before. I've done this, right? You say, God, I don't understand why my life is so difficult, so hard, and their life is so what? Yeah. It's just easier for them. It rains over their yard. When it rains nowhere else, it just rains over their yard. You're not laughing. You don't believe that. So in Houston, it might. That could be. It does that sometimes. And it doesn't rain over my yard. And this is just the way we feel about life sometimes. And in doing that and struggling with it and in dealing with it, it's very easy to kind of come up with the idea that, I just don't get the same breaks. It just doesn't work out for me the way it works out for someone else. And I'm just, unhappy about it, even, angry about it or bitter about it. This is just how life works out. And especially in this area of life, I can tell you that for me, and I think if Joni were in here, and she's not in this service, but if she were, so I can speak for her since she's not. Isn't that allowed? Because that way she has no way to counteract anything that I say. That she would say, just like I would, that marriage, and that's because you're in it, and you're in it every day and every moment, and you go through all the issues of life with someone. Marriage is maybe the most difficult thing in life. In some ways, especially, she would say, yes, especially being married to him, but that is part of it, right? Because you're married to another person. And at the same time, I think she would say, I know that I would say, it's still probably the most rewarding thing in life. The fact that you do go through it, and you have to go through it. And now, let me go ahead and say, this is not to say that this is taking a shot at anybody, who has been married before, or anyone who, is not married and may spend their entire life not being married. This is not an attempt to take a shot at any of that, because these things are true for all of us. And marriage and relationships may be the most difficult struggle, the most difficult thing that you go through. And it should, I think, make us even more sympathetic toward the other person or toward someone else rather than more judgmental. I think we should say, listen, I understand how difficult it can be. I know how much of a struggle that can be. But I also understand that it's difficult and it's a struggle because the benefits and the rewards of it are great. It's worth going through the struggle and the difficulties. I had a conversation. In fact, I wanted to use this because I think this might help you even as we're looking at relationships and marriage. I had a conversation probably a month ago with a friend of mine. We were looking at an issue, and we both made statements, and this is a good friend, both made statements which were totally opposite one another. My answer to the issue in dealing with something was no, and his answer was yes. And we are really good friends, and we have a lot of respect for one another. My respect for him is much more warranted than his for me, but we have a lot of respect for one another, but we totally disagreed on it. So let me tell you what happened or transpired that helped us go through it. I stopped and listened to his angle on the subject, and he was looking at something totally different about it from a totally different perspective than how I was looking at it. Same thing, same subject, and it ended up being just different angles on it. And as I listened to him, and I listened to why he said what he said, I voted for him. I agreed, because after listening to it, I was like, absolutely. I didn't think about it from that angle and from where you're coming from. And now that I listen to you and I think about it, I absolutely agree with you on that. Listen, this is one of those things that if you will learn to do this, and I understand, it's not easy because we tend to be stubborn. We tend to be, let me take it to the extreme, we tend to be hard-hearted. I'm not budging. I'm not changing. I've got to defend my position. Even if it's, now I realize it, I wasn't looking at the same thing that you were looking at when we were discussing this. I still must prove that I am, say it with me, R-I-G-H what? Yeah, right, R-I-G-H-C. The reason I spell it is because I have a 4-year-old granddaughter, and that's what her mom does all the time. She doesn't, tell me things, she spells them. And, unfortunately, she's getting really good at spelling, so she figures it out, so that's how we tend to think. And in order to defend our rightness, in order to defend the fact that, no, I know, and I have an angle that I'm looking at, and what happens is I tend to think that's the only angle. No one should look at this except from this one angle, and so I defend that fiercely. And I know that we say but you have to have your convictions. Yeah, absolutely. But at the same time, listen, none of us can build lasting, meaningful, productive relationships just by what we say, right? I know you think, well, you're a preacher. You don't believe that. That's all you do is stand up and talk. And listen, if you don't listen and if you don't gain from the other person's perspective, then the problem is you don't really learn. Nothing really happens or nothing really changes. It doesn't mean that you lose your convictions. It just means that you want to make sure that you understand what the other person is saying and how they see something. I will give you this, and I'm sure probably several times in this, but Ken Blanchard, who wrote The 1 Minute Manager. Anybody ever read the 1 Minute? Very popular business book. It's a wonderful book. A lot of people thought, as I did, that from his angle and reading it, the guy's a Christian. Well, later he admits, I was not. But he did become a Christian, and it's kind of interesting because he works on business principles all the time. And he said, at some point in my life, I realized all the good things that I was trying to work on and figure out, all those good things were already written. Somebody beat me to it in another book. He said, I just had never known that. I had never read the book before. And I think his wife kind of, got him to read this book. He's like, wow, he's saying everything I've spent my whole life trying to figure out is already said in there. And so there was an interview with Ken Blanchard, and a delightful guy, listening to him. He's in his mid to late 70s at the time. And he said his wife, so he's speaking for her, and I'm telling you, so this is like fifth-hand conversation, but he said, my wife, she said the other day she said, I finally realized I'm not going to change him. So I'm just going to love the lovable parts. Now, I love that. And I think that is just so amazing and so wise, because what it says is, listen, he has his angles. He has the way that he sees things. I'm going to learn to listen. I'm going to learn to understand. He needs to do the same thing, and I'm going to learn to love the what? Yeah, the lovable parts. Isn't that good? I think it is good, and I think it really applies to something like this. So just to let you know, I'm going to jump into a passage. This is in the New Testament. We could go all the way back to the beginning to Genesis, but actually Jesus is going to quote from that passage, as later writers in the New Testament will do, and he's going to talk about the same issue, and it works so well because in this passage, in fact, this is in the front of your outline, Jesus' critics, they want to use the idea of marriage as a way to trap him. Now, why would they trap Jesus on marriage, on relationships? Why would this be a trap? Because in their day, 2,000 years ago, just like in our day, this is controversial. And I know a lot of people think, and sometimes people will say, I remember the good old days when it was all. No, listen, it's always been that way. This is probably the most difficult thing that we deal with because our hearts are in it. And it speaks to the depths of our hearts and the depths of what we were made for and created for, and I think the depths of where we find real satisfaction and meaning in this relationship. So Jesus is in a similar situation that you might find yourself in if you got into a discussion about this. They decide they're going to trap him, and this is what it says. This is in Matthew chapter 19, pretty famous passage, but I'm going to hit it from a different angle than you might have heard it from before. This is what it says, verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying these things, so he's been preaching and talking and doing wonderful things. He says he left Galilee. He went down to the region of Judea, east of the Jordan River. This is just kind of set it up. Large crowds followed him there, and he healed their sick. Sorry, I'm not choked up over the issue, just choked up. Okay, so his critics, his opponents, his enemies, see this as, man, this guy's just gaining more and more popularity. He's doing incredible things, and he actually looks at their illnesses, he deals with them, and he actually brings about, health to their life. So this is a big threat to their position. So it says in the next verse, verse 3, so the Pharisees came and tried to trap him with this question. So they've thought through this. They decide this is one of those places we can get him, and I'll try to explain it just a little bit more for you. He says, should a man be allowed to divorce his wife for just any reason? Now, you might think that's a crazy statement. Why would they say that for just any reason? So you don't have to have any reason for it all. Here's the reason, and you might want to write this down in your outline. In his day, there were two major views as far as marriage and divorce were concerned. The one view was championed by a guy named Hillel, and his view was that the law of Moses made it okay for any person or any man to just write a letter, say, I divorce you, and hand it to his wife. Didn't have to be any reason for it. Didn't have to go before anybody and justify it, just say, and she is done. Then there was another view, which was the view of a guy named Shammai, and his view was, no, there's only one reason or only one way that a man could do this, and that would be if his wife were unfaithful. And that would not just mean that she had slipped up or messed up, but it means that she has decided, I'm not really with you. I'm going to go be with whoever I want to be, and I'm kind of, in that sense, here, but I'm abandoning the relationship, and it's just a betrayal in the relationship. And his view was that's the only reason. So you got one that says any reason, right? And you got, maybe that would be more of, current law of no-fault divorce. They don't really care about the issue, because this is too difficult to deal with. And the other view was, no, there's only one reason to do this. Does that make sense? And they were divided. In fact, it was a divided culture, just like ours would be. One person agrees with this side, and one person agrees with this side, and no one was going to look at the in-between or look at the other person's view or why they would say it. They just said, this is my view, and I'm sticking with it, no matter what. And there's this battle. And so here's what they think. He's got the crowds with him. Man, they love him. He's healing everybody. It didn't matter which view they held to. Didn't matter how they voted. It didn't matter, what their economic status was, their educational level. He's just dealing with everybody. At least, if we get in here, we can at least knock off one of those groups, that will say, I'm not with him anymore. He doesn't see it my way, right? I'm not voting for him anymore. I'm not following him anymore. I'm not listening to him anymore. Does this sound familiar? Sure. Because we become pretty stubborn, and we get to the point that our stubbornness turns into what? Hard-heartedness, right? Because if you don't see it my way, if you don't agree with me, if you're not going to look at it from this standpoint, then there's no way, that I am going to follow you or listen to you or have anything to do with you. And so they think they've got him. At least half of the group is going to be knocked off. At least half of the group is going to be separated from Jesus. And if we're really lucky, he will really mess up with some kind of, weird political statement where he loses both groups, right? He offends both groups in the statement. You ever seen that happen before? Sure. Because there's always these issues that we have that we think, no, this issue is so important. This is, my understanding and my seeing it this way is so important, that I'm not going to listen to or look to any view except or outside of my own view. So here's what Jesus does. This is verse number 4. Always great reading how Jesus responds to something. Haven't you read the what? So what is he doing? Listen, do the scriptures themselves, do they not speak to this already? Isn't it already spoken to? You notice what he didn't do? He didn't go to one group or the other. He didn't say, this guy, he didn't defend, for instance, Shemaiah, he's a nicer man, right? He's a better guy than Hillel is. He didn't do any of that. Jesus actually goes to the heart of the issue from his perspective, which is there's a God in heaven who created us. He made us. So let's look to what was God's purpose and what was God's plan. That way, it doesn't have to be one side or the other, one party or the other, one group or the other. Let's just go back and look at, what God himself, what he did. And the only place to look at that is to go back in the scriptures. And these guys, of all people, were guys who looked at it all the time. He said, do you not? So he's saying, don't you do this? Don't you go back and look at this? Here's what he says. They record that from the beginning, God made them, say this with me, God made them what? You know what this means? In the scriptures it says that God made man. And it refers to man in that sense as mankind. But it also says, if you go back in Genesis, he made man, and in a sense, what it's saying is he separated man, right? He says he made man, and he made man male and what? Female. Or as a friend of mine would always used to say, he made man, and from the man's standpoint, whoa, man, right? Because I like her a lot. She's a lot more attractive to me than, it's just, God, in a sense, in the scripture, made a separation. So God divides us. God separates us. God makes us different than the other person. Well, duh. Yeah. Aren't you glad? I often tell people when we do marriage counseling that the one thing you don't want to do is marry yourself. It's boring. Why would you want to marry yourself? Why would you want to marry someone who sees everything the same way you see it? Why would you want to marry someone who their perspective and their understanding and the way they approach it is the same way that you approach? That wouldn't make any sense. Why get married if you're just going to marry a mirror image of yourself? Now, do you want to marry someone who has, in one sense, the same sense of who created us and who made us and where we're going to go to work out our problems? Yeah. And what's going to hold us together? Don't you like it when someone says, we're so united because of our differences? It's one of my pet peeves. Differences don't unite anyone. Differences separate us. We are united because of something that pulls us together and unites us despite our differences. And that pulls us together and unites us means that different angles and different views and different strengths and different personalities can come together and form something that is bigger, stronger, more powerful, more fulfilling, more satisfying than if we're just stuck getting married to ourselves, So he says that he made mankind, but he made them, and this is just one separation that God made. He made them male and female. It speaks of a separation. Then look what it says. It says, verse 5, and he said, this explains why a man leaves his father and mother and is joined to his wife. And you're like, well, I don't understand. What do you mean it explains why? Because God separated them, and then here is this purpose of them coming back together is to be united, because he goes on and says, and the two are united into what? One. So in other words, God made us different. He separated us so that we could come back together as one. That doesn't make any sense. Oh, of course it does. Of course it does. Because then you find something that is so powerful and so amazing that it can bring two who are separated out of different views, different angles, different, emotional, logical, whatever separates you, whatever makes you different. And it brings those two pieces back together to form and to fit something. And if you look in Genesis, of course, the physical explanation of that, is that, so it takes flesh, a rib out of Adam. He makes Eve. He brings them back together. And Adam just realizes, wow, this is me. He actually says that. Bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. We're different, and yet at the same time, he realizes that that's a part of him. And it's a strange kind of mystical understanding sometimes, isn't it? Verse 6, he says this. Since they are no longer, say this with me, no longer what? But now they are what? Since they're no longer two, but they're now one, let no one split apart. And then he adds this, who has joined together? What God has joined together. So this is what Jesus is saying. If you look at it, this was God's plan. It's amazing. It's miraculous. You get to be a part of it. You make choices, as far as this is concerned. You have to learn how to work at it if you want to make it work, because it will not just work naturally. And I know I do a lot of, pre-marriage counseling and done a lot of marriage counseling. And I know people are like, well, I'm just looking for the one, It works so well. It's so easy. We never have to work at it. It ain't going to happen, right? It doesn't work that way. It was never designed to work that way. You work at it. You say it's that important. It matters that much. It matters so much that I'm willing to learn how to listen. It matters so much that I'm willing to learn as I listen, to appreciate, to realize that, without the attention in the relationship, it's going to be very difficult for us to grow together. It's exclusive in so many ways. You give up so many things in order to make this work. Why? Because of the priority of the relationship, because of the incredible wealth and goal and satisfaction of the relationship. Not because it's easy. Not because it's just so natural and it just happens and we just always think alike. My wife and I, we pretty much can complete one another's sentences. In fact, she will tell you that's one of my faults. I don't wait for her to complete her sentence. I do it for her because I know where she should go, and right. But you just learn one another, so well, and you also then learn how to be considerate of one another and another person's opinion. So this is verse 7. They go back at him. They said, then why did Moses say in the law that a man could give his wife a written notice of divorce and send her away, they ask. If God had intended this to be two coming back together. Now Jesus is certainly talking about the ideal of it and the plan of it, but he's always saying, but isn't that where we should go first, is to go to why did God do this, so that we can work at it? Not that we don't make mistakes, not that we're not flawed, not that it doesn't happen at times, it does, but shouldn't we go back, not lose the ideal and not lose God's design and God's plan and why did? Shouldn't we go back to that and say, but isn't that the most important thing, rather than, forming sides and stubbornness, one way or the other? So why did Moses say this? Jesus replied, here he goes. Moses permitted divorce only as a concession to what? Your hard heart, your stubbornness, your unwillingness to listen, to learn. You're saying, most important is for me to be right. For me to defend my view, my position, that's the most important thing. And of course, if you look at, again, as Jesus said, go back. The most important thing was two becoming what? Yeah. Not two defending themselves, not two being so stubborn and so hard-hearted that they were unwilling to work at it, to listen, to consider, to make it work, to find the great strength of the relationship, the great power of two people coming together, becoming one. Lifelong task, right? Never ends working at it. Some ways never becomes easier. A lot of ways becomes, can't change him, can't change her, so I'm going to love the lovable parts in order to make it work. Yeah. And then he goes on to say, but it's not what God originally intended. And I tell you this, whoever divorces his wife and marries someone else commits adultery. They abandon the relationship, is what he's saying, unless his wife has been unfaithful. I know you think, well, he disagreed with Shammai. No, he didn't. He's just saying there is a reality of it. There is, where it doesn't always work out, but that's still not the goal. That's still not how we go after it. So I want to give you two kind of lists here. One is from the secular side of it, just from the mankind side of it. How does this happen? What is the process of our hearts becoming hardened? How does this happen? And just from the human side of it, I just kind of put it in 3 steps because I think it works. If you and I look at it, the first thing is, we tend to, even in the midst of marriage and relationships, we tend to look around and see what we want. And that's what he's pointing to, because that was their struggle and their hard-heartedness. They say, okay, this is not working, or I don't like this, or this is too much work. And you see what you want. And then the second step is then we become obsessed with getting what we want. And that, from the human standpoint, if it's just me and my desires and what I want, and if that's the highest and greatest goal that there is, it makes sense. I see what I want. I'm obsessed with getting what I want, because if I can get what I want, then I'm going to be the happiest and the most fulfilled. And then the third step is, even if it means then, even for them, even if it means, even for us, even if it means breaking a covenant that I've made with this other person and God himself, before God. And it's not just a contract, it is a covenant that says, I'm in this because this is how God made me, this is what God himself designed, this is what he planned, and I'm in this for better, for worse, difficult, struggle, no matter how hard it is, and that's sort of the pattern from a secular standpoint. I want what I want, I see what I want, I'm going to go after it, I'm going to get it no matter what. And even if that means breaking a covenant or breaking a promise that I made, even before God, it's still the highest good and the highest goal is to get what I want, and that's where I'm going to find fulfillment. Now, on the back of your outline, I put, how does our heart become hardened? And this is really from the spiritual standpoint. And when you say spiritual in the Bible, it means from the standpoint that there is a God who created us, and we're more than just what we do in this life. There's something much deeper and more powerful about who we are, because God made us this way. So from that standpoint, the God God-centered or the God-involved part of us, the spiritual part of us, it's a different explanation as to how we get there. Two different angles, right? Looking at the same issue, the same problem from two different angles, and I think it's worth looking at and understanding. So how do we get there? How does our heart become hardened from that standpoint? Here's the first thing. We wander away from God and His plans. So I know you think, well, that's not how I started. I know, but that is what happens eventually. We begin to wander away from God and what God's plans are because it just doesn't seem to work out for us. We just can't seem to make this part work out. Here is Jesus, New American Standards, same verse, same passage, but this is a very literal translation. And this is what it says in verse 4. He answered and said to them, have you not read, He who created them from the beginning made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they're no longer two, but they are one. So he's talking about, this is God created this. Therefore God has joined together, let no man separate it. So he's saying this is His plan. So you look at it and you say, okay, God, obviously I don't fully understand your plan. I only see it from my angle. Okay. But God, I understand that if I don't learn to see it from your angle, if I don't learn to see the plan, that I'm going to miss the plan. There's no way I'm going to work this out in my life. Second step is we decide that we know better than God. I mean, we decide we're right. I know me better. I know my needs better. Here's what Paul writes to the Corinthians, and I love this passage. I know that I put verse 1 in there so you would catch that he was not talking specifically about marriage in this, because he says, now I write about meat that is sacrificed to idols. But I want you to see principally, it still is the same thing. He's talking about in their day, the Corinthians, meat would be sacrificed to all these Greek and Roman gods. Should you eat the meat? Should you not eat the meat? This is what they were struggling with. But look how he answers their dilemma. We know that we all have knowledge, and that doesn't mean that everybody's knowledge is correct. We just tend to say, I know. I see my angle. I know how I see it, and I know, and I will stick with what I know. We know we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs you up with pride. Yeah, because I see it my way. I'm going to defend my way. It is my way. It puffs you up with pride. He says, but love, this is what we've been dealing with, love does what? Love builds up. Love doesn't puff up. Love builds up. And it's not just the person who loves, but it's also the person who is being loved, who is then built up. And the reason he's doing this is because in the Corinthian church, Corinthians were very wealthy, very, very educated, very smart, talented people, but they were very disjointed, very dysfunctional. There wasn't a lot of unity among the group. Why? Because they tended to be puffed up and only their way and very stubborn. And that tended to fight against their hard-heartedness, tended to fight against their love and their unity. They're giving themselves to one another. They're finding their strengths and their talents and their personalities all multiplied because of this joinedness, because of love. Instead, there was a real disjointedness for them. It's verse number 2. He says, if you think you know something, you do not yet know anything as you should. But if any person loves God, that person is known by God. So he, again, takes it back to God's plan, who God is, and they realize, hey, God is smarter than I am. I love God's plan. I love who He is. I love God. And because of that, they are known by God. They know God. They grasp hold of that plan. Third thing is, we tend to chase our own appetites then and our desires as a way of finding what we believe will be an ultimate fulfillment and satisfaction in our life. So you kind of 3 steps there. Wander away from God and His plans. We decide we know better than God. I know my needs. I know how it works for me better. And because of that, I'm going to chase my own appetites and my own desires. And as I do that, then I'm going to find what really fulfills me and what really makes me feel good about life, because I'm chasing those things. It's a spiritual approach to it, and it's kind of backwards than the secular approach, but it ends up in the same place. And this is what Paul writes a couple of chapters earlier to the Corinthians. He says, you say, I'm allowed to do anything. He says, but not everything is good for you. And even though I am allowed to do anything, he says, I must not become a slave to anything. I love that, because that means, that's the idea that you've now become enslaved by your own desires. They rule over your life rather than have enough wisdom to do the right thing and the good thing, which would be a good thing for you. And in parentheses, or verse 13, he says, you say, food was made for the stomach. Here's their reasoning. Food was made for the stomach, and the stomach for food. This is true, though someday God will do away with both of them. But you can't say that our bodies were made for sexual immorality. They were made for the Lord, and the Lord cares about our bodies. So to say that I can just chase my appetites and my desires, take food. You get hungry, you eat, right? You feel any kind of desire or want or whatever, you go pursue it. That's how you find satisfaction. Paul's saying, you know that's not true. You can't do that. If you do that, if you become just a slave to your own desires and your appetites, you will make a disaster of your life. All your relationships will end up in a disaster if you become a slave just to your appetites and desires. That doesn't make any sense at all to approach it or to go after it that way. So how do you reverse the process? What do you do when you realize, and we all realize, right, that I have a tendency to do this from a secular standpoint, just as a human, from a spiritual standpoint? What do? You reverse the process. You realize, listen, I cannot just chase all of my appetites and desires. I can't just decide I'm smarter than God is. That wouldn't make any sense. And I go back to God into His plan and say, okay, God, what were your plans? Why did you make this thing called mankind, this thing called female and male people? Why was this designed? What were your plans in doing that? And you back up the process, going back to God and going back to God's plans, even though it may be controversial, even though people, may think that you're kind of a religious nut in doing it or something like that. You still go back because you realize, but there's a God who planned this. There's a God who made this. And this is how I can reverse my hard-heartedness, my stubbornness that prevents me from finding what I'm really looking for. Here's just one other verse. This is from the Message. This is a paraphrase, and this is Jesus in Matthew chapter number 6. I love the way this came out in Peterson's paraphrase. It says in verse 25, if you decide for God, that means if you decide I'm going to look to Him, living a life of God worship. And God worship is not just standing up and singing, right? God worship is saying, He made me, He created me, He's smarter than I am, He knows what I need. Maybe it's time for me to give it a shot in how I live my life in worshiping God, following Him and following His plan. If you decide living a life of God worship, it follows that you don't fuss about what's on the table at meal times. Isn't that great? Because your focus is different. Or whether the clothes in your closet are in fashion. That's not the major issue. It's not my desires or what I want or how I want people to perceive me. There is far more to your life than the food that you can put into your stomach. More to your outer appearance than the clothes you hang on your body. Totally different perspective. Totally reversing the process. Saying these things aren't the most important, but these things are. How I see God. How I listen to Him. How I look and I study and I acknowledge God made me. God knows me. I mean, there's no one, right? There's no one who knows what you need and what would satisfy you and what would fulfill you more than the one who made you, the one who created you. There's no one that would understand the path for your life And the things that you should go through, the things that you need to encounter, the way you need to pursue relationship, there's no one that would understand that more or better than the one who shaped you and formed you and made all of what we call history and holds all of what is in the guides, all that is in the future, more than he would. Listen, you wouldn't do this. I wouldn't do this. Say, no, I'm smarter than he is. I can tell you the future better than he can tell you the future. I know what I need, what I really need, more than he knows what I really need. I can tell you what I want, right? But I can't necessarily tell you what I need. With my daughter, close with this little story. A week or so ago, granddaughter just turned 4 years old. Anybody got any grandkids? Okay, you'll get old one day. And you get, and it's wonderful. And with my grandkid, and so we're going downhill in a stroller. And as a 4-year-old, just turning 4-year-old, she's a big girl, and she's decided she doesn't need to be strapped into the stroller. So it's okay. Her mom is like, okay, you don't have to be strapped in the stroller because you want to be free. And of course, I'm like, you really want to be free? Walk. Get out of this. So, but that didn't work. No, carry me, So I understand, she's growing and she's learning. So then all of a sudden we're going down the hill and she's sitting on the front edge of the seat in the stroller. Well, mom's like, no, not doing that. You're either going to be strapped in or you're going to sit back in the stroller or we're not going anywhere. And that lip goes out and she just sits there and crosses those little arms, and she just sits there, not moving. So we just stand there. And I'm like, yep, this is what you go through. And then later that day, this is what my daughter told me. She says, I know exactly what was going through her mind. She said, because Dad, I remember when Mom and I would have those same battles. And in my mind, even as a little 4-year-old, she said, I remember I was thinking I am, and this is where I got to spell it out because my granddaughter was still around. I was R-I-G-H-T, right? I'm right. I know what I need. I know what I want. And then she admitted, she said, and I also knew I'm smarter than Mom. And then she said, I still am smarter than Mom. And, I said, yeah, we tend to think it that way. We tend to see it that way. I know what I need more than they do. Even though Mom is looking out for her safety, looking out for her well-being, but at the same time, in order to do that, she has to get her to do things she does not want to do, right? Sure. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you that you made us. And we don't have to go through life just wondering what we're like or how we were made, but instead we have someone that understands us, who knows us, who has made it his desire and his goal, your desire and your goal, to grow us up, to walk with us, to show us that a lot of the things that we think would make us happy and a lot of the things that we think are better than what we have are really not. Because you love us with such a great love. And you're patient with us, amazingly patient. It's your desire to lead us and to guide us. And it's our part to trust you and to believe you. So if you're here this morning and you've never trusted God, we all understand how hard it is. We all understand the battle that we go through inside to say, but I want. But this morning to come to grips with the fact that there is a God who loves you, who wants the best for you. In fact, he gave the best for you. The life of his own Son, so that you would know how much he cares. So you could feel His mercy, His compassion upon your own life. And those feelings of knowing how much God loves you would stir up a new love and compassion and a new trust in Him. If you've never put your hope in God's gift, His provision for you, you can do that this morning. Realizing that He gave His Son for you, that Jesus Christ came to free you, to connect you, grow you, build you up, give you power and strength in your own life to do the right thing even when it goes against your own desires, the good thing, the fulfilling thing. And Jesus Christ wants to come, set you free, take your sins away, bring about a health and a strength in your own life if you will trust Him and believe Him. In Jesus' name we pray.